Welcome back to Subversive Preacher. My name's Cameron Miller, and this is a sermon for the day of Pentecost 2024. And it begins with something that may or may not be of any interest to you, and that is that about 10% of your body, yours and mine, is composed of hydrogen. Okay? Plus, we have trace elements of lithium that just come with the package when we're born. Now, the odd thing about that hydrogen and that lithium is that they originated in the Big Bang. That's a fact. Now, most of the rest of the human body is composed, 86% of its mass is composed of stardust, literally. And actually, it's pre-solar stardust, meaning that it was dust that was around before our own star was born. Well, that's a fact. Now, I don't know if that makes you feel better about your body or just a whole lot older. So, another way of saying that, if you're imaginative and poetic, is what Wendell Berry wrote. From the beginnings of the world, his arrival and her welcome have been prepared. They've always known each other. So you see, it isn't all just about the facts. It's also about how we tell the story. And here's what I mean. 2,617 years ago, that's 2,617 years ago, the heavens opened and Ezekiel had visions of God. Actually, in July, it's going to be 2,618 years ago. Now, Ezekiel one of his scribes tells us that at the very beginning of his prophecy, where it says, in the 13th year, in the 4th month, on the 5th day, while I was among the exiles by the Kebar River, the heavens were opened and I saw visions of God. In our language, that's July 31st, 593 BCE. And that's a fact. At a specific moment in time, someone who claimed to be a Hebrew prophet named Ezekiel had a vision. Now, visions are facts too, you know. Not the facts that we can replicate in the laboratory, but still, to the one who's had it, the experience is a fact. Whether the visions turn out to be true or not, well, now that's also factual. The experience of the vision is factual to the person who's had it. But whether that vision or what that vision is and what it meant, well, now that's not a fact, that's a story. Anyway, it is important to know that Ezekiel had his vision 4 years after a terrible disaster that happened. A terrible disaster that had a long life. Let me start that again. It's important for us to know that Ezekiel had a vision 4 years after a terrible disaster for his people and his nation, which had a long life, when he then had the vision of dry bones returning to life. Now, at a time when his people, because of that disaster I mentioned, had no hope whatsoever, Ezekiel, because of his vision, gives a prophecy of hope. So you see, in 597 BCE, the Babylonian Empire was alive and well, and the infamous King Nebuchadnezzar wielded power all over the Fertile Crescent and lands beyond. Just the name of Nebuchadnezzar was enough to fill the air with fear. Now that's a fact. Another fact is that the public entrance to Nebuchadnezzar's palace was this long, elaborate hallway leading to the throne room where King Nebuchadnezzar would receive heads of state and emissaries from all the vassal states and nations he had vanquished or enslaved. The hallway was as long as a football field, and it was adorned on both sides with huge, elaborate, chiseled and painted scenes of battle. Each panel of these, for this 100-yard hallway, told the story of Babylonian conquests. Each scene depicted what happened to the vanquished. Some of the scenes revealed in gory detail the punishments that had been meted out by those kings and others who were rebellious against Nebuchadnezzar. Heads on spears formed fencing around cities laid to waste. Bodies flayed, which is another way of saying skinned alive. Women and children ravaged and enslaved, just to mention a few choice depictions. Now, the point of displaying all this carnage in this particular hallway was that those waiting to see Nebuchadnezzar had to shuffle through a long, slow-moving line through these scenes, blaring to them on either side like neon billboards. And the message projected was one of power and might and threat and warning and violence. Now, I mention all that because Ezekiel is writing his lovely dry bones story while shivering under the shadow of the Babylonian Empire. You see, Jerusalem had its own king and had been a sovereign country for about 400 years, twice as long as the United States, just to put it in perspective. And in the year 597 BCE, 4 years before Ezekiel's prophecy, vision, King Nebuchadnezzar overpowered the tiny kingdom of Judah and then imprisoned its king in exile in Babylon. Now, it's doubtful that Judah's defeated king walked down that hallway I just described, because it's more likely he was just thrown in a dark, dank cell. That's probably a fact. But Nebuchadnezzar then enthroned his own choice for king, and it was a local nabob named Zedekiah. Now, Zedekiah sat on the throne in Jerusalem for 10 years, feeling much more important than he was. And all through that decade, Egypt was a siren singing in Zedekiah's ear. Egypt was not under the influence of Babylon at that time, but it was also no longer a very powerful, mighty empire. But Egypt kept sending missionaries to Zedekiah over the 10 years, tempting his ego. That's a fact. Egypt kept promising Zedekiah that if he just joined Egypt's global initiative and rebelled against Babylon, then Egypt, would send armies, and then together they could be a great coalition force to defeat the dreaded enemy. The Egyptians promised that Zedekiah would be a real king, not just a puppet for Nebuchadnezzar, and then everything would be right with the world. So finally, Zedekiah attacked Babylon and Nebuchadnezzar, initiating a rebellion. That's a fact. But wouldn't you know it, the Egyptian army never showed up. Oops. The mighty Babylonians came through, swooping in, destroying Solomon's temple in Jerusalem, sacked and burned the city, and probably doing a lot of beheading and flaying as they did. And then they took Zedekiah and his family back to Babylon. And that's fact too. No doubt Zedekiah became one of those scenes on the hallway, because here's what Nebuchadnezzar did to him. In front of Zedekiah, where Zedekiah, standing powerless, had to sit there and watch as Nebuchadnezzar had both his sons sliced up by swords and killed. And if that wasn't bad enough, he then had Zedekiah's eyes pulled out, so that the death of his sons was the last thing he ever saw. And then they threw him in jail, prison, whatever that was, until he was forgotten. That's a fact, actually. The court records of Nebuchadnezzar actually confirm that biblical record. So 4 years later, Zedekiah was only a curse on the tongues of the survivors in Judah. 4 years later, likewise, the Judean exiles taken back into Babylon were hopeless. 4 years later, Jerusalem lay in ruins, crops and orchards, nothing but charred and blackened nubs, bitterness and grief lining the graves and the rock. And so Ezekiel writes about dry bones returning to life. Everything around them was ruin, brutality, violence defined their lives. The few with power and might and weapons controlled the destiny of the many, and God, who was supposed to be powerful and just, allowed it all to happen. Now that's a very painful fact too. Yet knowing what he knew, Ezekiel wrote a story of hope. The message of the story was clear. It ain't over. And God, not Nebuchadnezzar, has the last word. That's a fact. Less than half a century later, 47 years in fact, the Assyrians defeated the Babylonians, and Cyrus, king of the universe as he became known, allowed exiles to return home and restore Jerusalem and build a new temple. The dry bones did, in fact, live again. Now, I'm not telling you that story, believe me, to be proof that the Bible is factual. Some of it may be, and even some of the stories that are not factual can still contain nuggets of truth. In fact, facts stacked one on top of another or in columns side by side, they don't tell us very much. Sometimes the facts all by themselves don't even tell us the truth. It's the narrative that weaves them all together into a story or a poem or a song that tell us what we need to know. The fact is, the so-called church didn't really begin until 325 CE, when the Roman Empire appropriated a popular religious movement and then used coercive power to inflict conformity on it. The Nicene Creed is a symbol of that coerced conformity. That's when the church actually began, even though the day of Pentecost is when we say it did. But our story says that something did happen 300 years before Constantine, and about 2 months after Jesus was executed by the state for insurrection. It was something happened that was weird, that even gets replicated in liturgy now, used by Pentecostals still today. A liturgy by Pentecostals, by the way, as learned and prescribed as our own in the Episcopal Church, but it appears to be quite different. We do not know the facts about the day of Pentecost because they weren't independently verified by outside sources. But something happened, and our story claims it as the beginning. We need to read that Pentecost story like we read Rendell Berry's poem, or like we do the dry bones story. It tells us that what we do here in our communities, our spiritual communities of worship, what we do around this table, sing together, pray together, eat together, share our tears and laughter together, that it's not about facts. It's about story. A story that tells the truth. A story that indicates or that includes the facts of our own lives. A story that we are part of. A story we even know to be true. Well, that's my story, and I'm sticking with it.